Today's daf is daf mem dalid, and let's review what we saw at the bottom of mem gimel amid beis. The pasuk says in Parshas Achremos, "V'chol adam lo yeh bi'oel moed," and what that means is that when the Kohen Gadol is being maktir the ketores lifnai v'lifnim, the heichal has to be out of bounds for everyone. No one's allowed to be in the heichal, which is close to the Kodesh Kodashim, while the ketores is being brought. And the problem here is that according to our Mishnah, there's a Kohen who is Memaris Es Hadam, and he's located on the Roved Haravi. And that, the Gemara assumes, is inside the Heichal. How could it be inside the Heichal, waiting for the Kohen Gadol to come out when the Kohen Gadol is involved in the Haktaras HaKtores, and the Torah says, Lo Yeh Bi'ol Moed. And we learned a Brisa here on the top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph that there's no prohibition about somebody being in the Azara during the Haktaras HaKtores, but only in the Heichal. That's out of bounds, but the Azara is not out of bounds. And that's derived from the pasuk, the Oel Moed. And Oel Moed refers to the Heichal and not to the Azara. The Gemara went ahead, if you recall, we covered this at the end of the Shia yesterday, that how do we know that this din of Oel Moed applies in Shiloh and Beis Olamim? After all, Oel Moed is only in the Midbar, and that's where the avodah is done by Aaron in the Midbar, in the Oel Moed. And the Gemara, quoting a Brisa, has an extra pasuk, Ba Kodesh, and that's a ribui to teach us that the status of Mishkan and Migdash is the same in Shiloh and in Beis Olam. Beis Olam refers to the Beis HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo. So therefore, the Iser of entering into the Heichal that we mentioned earlier applies not only in the Mishkan in the Midbar, but also in Shiloh and Beis Olam. Now, what about the Shas Matan Domim? It was with regard to the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, there was a requirement of Matan Domim, and that took place in the Kodesh Kodashim. Is there an Iser for anyone to enter into the Heichal during the time of the Matan Domim in the Kodesh Kodashim that was subsequent to the Haktaras HaKtores? And the Brisa quotes a pasuk, Bivo L'chaper, and Bivo L'chaper now includes, it's a ribui that includes this Iser of entering into the Heichal even during the Hazaras Damim. And the Hazaras Damim is included in the Apara process, Bivo L'chaper. So when the Kohen Gadol enters into the Kodesh Kodashim, L'chaper, he's doing so not only during the time of the Haktaras HaKtores, but also during the time of the Hazaras Damim. And then the Brisa concludes by quoting another ribui to include even after the Kohen Gadol has completed the avoda in the Kodesh Kodashim, but he hasn't yet left the Kodesh Kodashim. Until he comes out of the Kodesh Kodashim, based on a ribui of I'd say so, the Brisa establishes the Iser of Lo Yeh, Kol Adam Lo Yeh B'Ol Moed applies. So here's where we're up to for today's daf, on daf mem dalid amud aleph. V'chiper bi'ado ubiad beso. So you can find this approximately 7 lines down from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the top of the Yoma. And this is the end of the brisa that we almost completed yesterday. The brisa quotes the pasuk v'chiper ba'ado bi'ad beso bi'ad kol kal Yisrael. And the sequence here is very critical. First, it's kaparoso kodemes lekaparas beso, and kaparas beso kodemes lekaparas echov hakohanim. And kaparas echov hakohanim kodemes lekaparas kol kahal Yisrael. We're talking about the vidui of the Kohen Gadol, and this pasuk is teaching us that with regard to the first vidui of the Kohen Gadol on his par, he mentions his own chatoim first, then the chatoim of Bnei Beso, his wife and his household. Only in the second vidui, that's what we learned back on Naf Mem Aleph, does the Kohen Gadol mention the sin of the Kohanim. And the sin of Klal Yisrael is only going to be recited in that vidui over the Soil Azazah. It's a little bit odd that we need a special pasuk for Beso. If Beso means his wife, I mean, l'chora, we should apply the principle here of Ishto Keguf. I'm not sure why we need a pasuk for them. In any event, Omar Mar, we're going to now hone in on one particular segment of this brisa. Ainli ela b'shas haktorah. I would only assume that the Isur of Lo Yavo of Lo Yeba'ol Moed only applies when the Kohen Gadol is involved in Aktoras HaKtores. My mashma. Why do we have such a havamina? Why shouldn't the Hazaz Damim be included? Omar Rav, v'chein Omar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, v'chein Omar Rav Lazar, Omar Kra, v'chiper ba'ado bi'ad beiso, bi'ad kol kahal Yisrael. And it would seem that the kapara here is equal for all these three groups. First of all, ba'ado, and secondly, bi'ad beiso, and thirdly, bi'ad kol kahal Yisrael. And in what context is there an avoda, the Kohen Gadol, with a kapara that's equal for everyone? Ezi kapara sheshavalo ulebeis alach v'kohanim ulchol kal Yisrael harei zeh haktoras haktores. And this could not be referring to the azas damim of the parashal Kohen Gadol and the soyer lechatus, because those karbanos have no kapar power for all of Kal Yisrael. The partial Kohen Gadol will only be mechaper for the Kohen Gadol and Beso and the Ochiv HaKohanim, and the Soyer is a mechaper for the balance of Klal Yisrael. This pasuk is discussing a kapara that is shaveh, that is one kapar for everyone, all these groups. So it must be referring to the Aktoras HaKtoras. So the Gemara says Ktoras Mechaperes. The premise here that you're operating with is that the Ktoras generates a kapara in. And the Gemara says the Hatani Rabbi Chananya Lamanu Ktoras Mechaperes. From where in the Torah do we arrive that there is inherent in the Ktoras a power to generate kapara? And now this brisa of Rabbi Chananya is going to quote a pasuk in the parsha of Korach, Shenemar vayitein es haktores vaychaper ala And after the merid of Korach, there was a terrible magefa, and this was a result of Lashon Hara, in which the people of Israel, when they saw the deaths of Korach Adaso, they declared Atem Hamitem Es Am Hashem, as if to say Moshe and Aaron were responsible for the death of Korach. And the plague that came about as a punishment for this terrible Lashon Hara, Moshe told Aaron to be makti the Ketores as a kapara, which Aaron did, and that's what stopped the Magefa. We see clearly that Ketores mechaperes metani to Rabbi Shmuel al ma Ketores mechaperes al Lashon Hara. And what is the connection here between the Ketores and the Lashon Hara? What's inherent in the Ketores that links it specifically to the Aveira of Lashon Hara? Yavo dover shebechashoy v'yichaper al ma'aseh chashoy. Generally speaking, people speak Lashon Hara in private, and certainly the Haktoros was done in private in the Kodesh Kodashim. And therefore, there's a connection between the two. Even though in the Parsha of Korach, there the Lashon Hara was actually public, but in general, Lashon Hara generally is done in Chashai in private. Tanan Hasam, now the Gemara quotes a Mishnah Masechet Kelim, Parshim the Bein Ha'ulam v'Lemizbeach B'Shas HaKtorah. That not only is there an Isur of lo yeh biol moed at the time of the Aktoras Aktoris, and biol moed is a reference to the Heichal, but even the area between the Azara and the Heichal, which is called the area of Bein Ulam Lemizbeach, so the Mizbeach on the eastern side, and there's a distance of 22 amos until you get from that area to the Ulam. And that area, which we discussed earlier in the Masechet, as far as the Shechita B'Tzafon of Kodesh Kodashim, anyway, that area, Bein Ulam Mizbeach, is also included, and we'll soon see that that's only the Rabbanon, in this Isur of Kol Adam Lo Yeh Ba'ol Moed. So it's not only the Ol Moed, which is the Heichal, but even a place which is technically part of the Azara is also included in this Isur. And apparently the Chachamim were worried that if a person is that close to the Ulam, and let's assume that the Ulam has a Kedushas Heichal Midoraisa, let's assume, then in that area, Ben Ulam Mizbeach, which is closely proximate to the Ulam, a person might possibly, during the time of the Torah and Azos Domim, might inadvertently enter into the Heichal and violate the Tzitz Torah. Omra Beloz Lo Shara L'B'Shas Torah De Heichal. Aval B'Shas Torah De Lifnai V'Lifnim Me Heichal Parshi Me Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach Lo Parshi. Rabbi Eliezer now introduces the distinction that we're familiar with between the Ketores on a daily basis, which was burned twice a day in the Heichal, as opposed to the Ketores, the extra Ketores on Yom Kippurim that was burnt by the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh Kadosh. And Rabbi Lazar is qualifying the Mishnah in Kalim that we learned before, and the Mishnah in Kalim that extends the Isur of Lo Yeh B'Yol Moed to include even Bein Ulam, the area of Bein Ulam and Mizbeach. That's only with regard to the Ketores that was burnt daily and on Yom Kippur in the Heichal. So therefore, if a person will enter into this area Bein Ulam Mizbeach, that 22 Amma area, then he might inadvertently enter into the Heichal. But, says Rabbi Lazar, we're not going to extend the Iser of Loyeh Biol Moed beyond the Heichal with regard to the Ketores that was special Ketores of Yom Kippurim that was burnt Lifnai v'Lifnim. And B'Shas HaKtorah the Lifnai v'Lifnim Heichal Parshi. The Isra or the requirement of Prisha that one should not enter into the Heichal only applies to the Heichal. But anyone could go in to the area Bein Ulam Mizbeach during the Aktaras HaKtores Lifnai v'Lifnim, because that area Bein Ulam Mizbeach is not Heichal, it's not Ol Moed. You might ask, why didn't the Rabbanan institute the same Gzeira that they did in the case of the Haktoras Ktores on a daily basis in the Heichal? And that's going to be a discussion of the Gemara a little bit later on. But in general, what we're saying is that just on a simple level, the distance between the Ulam Lemizbeach area and the Heichal is a skip and a hop. Whereas if the Ktoretz is being burnt in the Kodesh Kodashim, you could talk about not going into the Heichal, but to add to it the area of Ben Ulam Mizbech, that's already distant, that's already far away. Just on a simple level. Masiv of Adabar Ava v'Amrilei Kidi. The word Kidi is either the name of a Chacham or more likely the way we usually learn it. Kidi is an anonymous Tana, and this is the kasha that's being brought. Actually, Kidi would not be referring to a Tana here. In this case, it would be referring to an Amora. And let's read this price. Rabbi Yotzi Omer Keshem sheParshin mi bein ha'ulam lemizbeach b'shas haktorah kach Parshin b'shas matan par kohen Mashiach upar elim dava shel tzibur se'irei avodas kochavim. We have here three cases that belong to the category called chatos pnimios. And there's going to be a matan domim in these chatos pnimios inside the heichal itself, not in the Kodesh Kadosh, but inside the heichal. And during the time period of matan domim in the heichal of these chatos pnimios, the Brisa of Rabbi Yossi establishes that we require preacher, and no one's allowed to be found bein ulam lemizbeach. Now, let's talk about these three different kinds of chatos. They're all chatos pnimios. First, we have the par Kohen Mashiach. So that means that the Kohen Gadol was Mashuach, he was anointed. If he introduces a horah, if he hands down a verdict that's against the Torah in something that's very severe, then if he follows through with that horah, he has to bring a chatos, which is called par Kohen Mashiach. And we have something a little bit similar in the case of par helim dava shel tzibur, when the Sanhedrin themselves were accidentally matir something that's osur mi isur kares, and they had a mistaken horah. Then we have not a par lachatos, but we're talking about a sa'ir, which is brought in addition as a different kind of a carbon in the case where the Rov Tzibur of Klal Yisrael inadvertently worshipped Avodah Zarah. There was some sort of mistaken horah. Now, the dam of all these three chatos pnimios needs hazah 7 times on the paroches that separates the heichal from the Kodesh Kadosh. And in addition, there's going to be a matan domim on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach HaPnimi, all told 11 hazos. And the requirement of Prisha between Ulam and Mizbeach will apply according to the Brisa of Rabbi Yotzi, even during the Hazos Damim in the Heichal of the Chatos Pnimis. So the Prisha of Bein Ulam LeMizbeach for the Hazos Damim of these Karbanos called Chatos Pnimis, and we also have Prisha, as we said earlier, regarding the Heichal during the Hazos Damim of the Par and the Sar of Yom Kippurim, where the Damim is applied again in the Heichal. Again, there were Hazos in the Kodesh Kadoshim, but we're talking about now the Heichal. So the strange thing is that this Brisa that establishes the name of Yossi Prisha from Bein Ulam Mizbeach B'Shas Torah does not mention actually the Azos of the Par and the Soyer on Yom Kippurim in the Heichal. And it could be because since the Dam is not limited to the Heichal, but also applies to Kodesh Kedoshim, therefore, at least in certain Hados Damim, we would not extend the Isa, the requirement of Prisha, to the area of Bein Ulam LeMizbeach with regard to the Hazos Bifnim in the Kodesh Kadosh on the Parvis Soyer of Yom Kippur. Now we go on in the Brisa. Hama Mailo Yesh Bein HaHeichal LeBein HaUlam LeMizbeach. The Brisa establishes that there's a certain chumrah, a milo, that applies to the heichal that doesn't apply to the area of Bein Ulam LeMizbeach. Fine. And in the Reisha of the Brisa, we get the impression that with regard to Prisha, there's no difference between the heichal and Bein Ulam LeMizbeach. But now the Brisa says there is a difference. Shall be heichal portion bein b'shas haktorah, bein shelo b'shas haktorah. Bein Ulam LeMizbeach in portion elo b'shas haktorah. Now the assumption here is that we're talking about the haktorah of the Ktoris. And what we're saying is that what? Let's go over this. That with regard to the Heichal, we're going to be Poresh, whether it's B'Shas HaKtorah or Shelo B'Shas HaKtorah. Meaning, even during the time after Haktoras Haktoras Lifnai Lifnim, during the time of Hazas Dam. However, when we talk about the Prisha in the area, not in the Heichal, but in Bein Ulam Mizbeach, then the Isa Prisha, or the requirement of Prisha, if you want to call it that, only applies during Haktoras Haktores, but not during Hazas Damim. And the Gemara says, B'Shas Haktorah Mia Parchi. It seems that from this Brisa, that at least during the time of the Haktorah of the Ketores, we require a Prisha from the area of Ben Ulam Mizbeach. Now, what Haktoras are we talking about? My love, shouldn't we assume B'shas Haktorah Dilifnai V'lifnim? And we just had a memra of Rabbi Lozer who said that there is no requirement of Prisha Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach during the Haktoras Haktorah. But here in this brisa it says that with regard to Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach, Ein Parshim Ela B'Shas Haktorah, but B'Shas Haktorah there is a requirement of Prisha Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach. That's an open and definite contradiction to Rabbi Lozer's statement that during the Haktoras Haktoras, the Prisha is only from the Heichal and not Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach. So the Gemara answers, no, that's not what the brisa, that's not how we understand this brisa. Lo, b'shas haktorah de heichal. What it means is that we're referring not to the ktores lifnai v'lifnim, that special haktorah of ktores on Yom Kippur, but rather to the daily haktorah of the heichal, meaning the ktores that's brought in the heichal on the Mizbeach HaPnimi twice daily. And during the Haktorah in the Heichal, that's when the Prisha extends to include even Bein Ulam Mizbeach. But during the Haktorah, the special unique Haktoras of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim and the Kodesh Kadoshim, that's where, as we saw in Rabbi Lozer, there's no Chiv Prisha with regard to Bein Ulam Mizbeach. So now we have the following. When we're doing the avoda of the Ketores in the Heichal, which is the daily Haktoras twice daily, then we require Prisha not only from the Heichal, but also from the next area, which is Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach. When we're talking about the Haktoras of Yom Kippurim, L'fnai V'Lifnim, then the requirement of Prisha is extended to and limited to the Heichal. It doesn't apply outside the Heichal in the area Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach. Now, Ihachi, says the Gemara, let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Kalim that we quoted says that there are various milos, and there's a mila to Harabayis, a stringency with regard to Harabayis, and then we go to the Chel, and then from the Chel over to the Ezras Noshim to the Azara, the Ezras Kohanim, and then we get to the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach, and the Ulam, and the Heichal, and then the Kodesh Kadoshim. These are the various milos that are being enumerated by the Mishnah in Kalim. And when it comes to Ulam Mizbeach, the Mishnah sets up a mila of Parshim, that there's an obligation to be Poresh, Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach. So the Gemara asks, Hama Mila, why is it that this is called a Chumrah, a special Mila, in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach? Because since we're saying that the area of the Heichal and the area of the Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach is now the Gemara assumes that it's one kedusha, and you're trying to set up some separate din of Mila, of a Chumrah in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach, V'sulo, and furthermore, if the Mishnah in Kalim is trying to establish a Mila in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach, why do they have to mention Prisha Ika Ha Mila? Why don't we talk about the following Mila? The Ilu Me Heichal Parshi Bein B'Shas Haktorah Didei. bein b'shas haktorah d'lifnai v'lifnim, v'ilu bein ulam u'mizbeach, lo parshi ela b'shas haktorah deheichal. Just to review the Gemara's kasha here. If b'shas haktorah lifnai v'lifnim, there's no din of prisha bein ulam mizbeach, then why does the Brisa focus, the Mishnah actually, focus on or single out the Mila in the din prisha of Heichal as opposed to Ben Ulam Mizbeach because of Shelo b'shas haktorah, meaning during Shas Matan Dom? Why not mention the Mila of Heichal Parshi Ben Shas haktorah Dibei u'Bein Shas haktorah D'Lifnai V'Lifnim? With regard to the Heichal, we require a prisha, whether it's during the Shas HaKtorah in the Heichal, or it's the Shas HaKtorah Lifnai V'Lifnim. Whereas in the area of Ben Ulam Mizbeach, it must be on a lower level. It doesn't have that Mila, because there's no Prisha Ben Ulam Mizbeach unless it's Shas HaKtorah de Heichal. But if it's Shas HaKtorah Lifnai V'Lifnim, then there's no requirement of Prisha. So why does the Brisa have to bring this Mila of Shelo b'shas haktorah, meaning during the Matan Domim? Even b'shas haktorah is a Mila. And the Gemara answers, Haktani, this is indicated in fact in the Brisa, because that's what the Brisa has in mind when it says, Ela shebeheichal parchim bein b'shas haktorah bein shelo b'shas haktorah, meaning whether it's the Haktorah in the Heichal or it's this Haktorah or it's not the time of the Haktorah in the Heichal, but rather it's the Haktorah of Lifnai V'Lifnim. So now Shelo b'shas Haktorah means the Haktorah Lifnai V'Lifnim. We didn't know that until now. Until now, in the Havmina, we thought Shelo b'shas Haktorah means Matan Domim. Now we're saying Shelo b'shas Haktorah means the Haktorah Lifnai V'Lifnim. Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach Ein Parshin, and here we turn to Daf Mem Daled Amid Beis, Ella b'shas Haktorah. Right? Ulam L'Mizbeach is only during the Haktorah of the Ketores in the Heichal, but during the time of the Haktorah L'Fnai V'Lifnim, there's no preacher between Ulam and Mizbeach, as we said in the name of Rabbi Lazar.